The Interstellar Combat Championships had, over the past 3 centuries, evolved into something of a bureaucratic nightmare, wrapped in the glittering facade of galactic entertainment. What had once been a simple matter of warriors beating each other senseless for the amusement of bloodthirsty crowds had transformed into a labyrinthine organization, complete with 17 different governing bodies, 43 subspecies classifications, and enough paperwork to deforest a small moon. The irony, of course, was that most of the participating species had evolved beyond the need for paper millennia ago. The arena floating in the neutral space between the Andorian cluster and the Vega territories was a marvel of engineering excess. Spanning roughly the size of a small city, it boasted artificial gravity generators that could simulate the environmental conditions of over 2,000 different worlds, atmospheric processors capable of maintaining 17 different gas mixtures simultaneously, and a sound system so advanced it could make a whisper audible to spectators 3 sectors away, while somehow managing to make the actual announcements completely unintelligible. Today's main event had drawn representatives from across the galaxy, each convinced that their species had produced the ultimate warrior. The Zelonians, with their naturally occurring exoskeletons that could deflect plasma fire, lounged in their crystalline viewing pods with the smug satisfaction of beings who had never met a projectile they couldn't deflect. The Thraken delegation occupied the heated sections of the arena, their regenerative abilities allowing them to casually lose limbs during their own enthusiastic cheering without missing a beat. The more techie contingent floated in their meditation spheres, their collective telekinetic abilities occasionally causing snacks to orbit their heads in neat little patterns. And then there were the humans, tucked away in a modest section that the arena's automated systems had apparently forgotten to upgrade since the facility's construction. Roughly 3 dozen humans sat in what could charitably be described as chairs, and less charitably described as metal folding torture devices. They had no natural armor, no regenerative abilities, no psychic powers, and according to the official combat statistics, the collective physical prowess of a particularly ambitious houseplant. The betting pools, managed by a consortium of Chiparian bookmakers whose mathematical abilities were matched only by their complete inability to comprehend the concept of an upset, had established odds that were less numbers and more expressions of cosmic certainty. Human victory was listed at approximately the same likelihood as the universe spontaneously reorganizing itself into a giant cup of tea. This assessment seemed entirely reasonable to anyone who bothered to examine the facts. Humans had participated in the championships for exactly 47 years and had achieved a win-loss record that could best be described as tragic and more accurately described as statistically taxing, indistinguishable from random chance if random chance had been having a particularly bad century. The arena's announcing team, consisting of Vorthak the Eternal and Zixnox of the Thousand Eyes, had built their considerable reputations on their ability to make even the most predictable match sound like an epic confrontation between cosmic forces. Today, however, even their combined centuries of hyperbolic experience were being tested. Beings of the galaxy, Vorthak's voice boomed across the arena's 17 different communication frequencies. Today, we witness what may very well be the most spectacular mismatch in championship history. Zixnox's Thousand Eyes rotated in what his species considered an expression of barely contained enthusiasm. Indeed, Vorthak. In the red corner, representing the savage beauty of Thraken Prime, we have Krex'thor the Unstoppable. 7 feet of pure regenerative fury, winner of 97 consecutive matches, and proud possessor of the ability to regrow lost limbs during combat breaks. The crowd erupted in a sound that would have been cheering if cheering could somehow be performed underwater while gargling gravel. Krex'thor raised all 4 of his arms in acknowledgement, his naturally armored hide gleaming under the arena's lights. His regenerative abilities were so advanced that he had once continued fighting after being temporarily decapitated, growing a new head while his old one provided commentary from the sidelines. And in the blue corner, Vorthak continued, his voice somehow managing to convey both professional obligation and personal bewilderment. Representing the tenacious spirit of Earth, we have Zara Chen. The human section erupted in polite applause that was immediately swallowed by the arena's vast emptiness. Zara emerged from the preparation area with all the dramatic flair of someone showing up for a routine dental appointment. She stood exactly 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed approximately as much as one of Krex'thor's individual limbs, and appeared to possess no special abilities whatsoever beyond the rather unremarkable human talent for looking mildly bored in extraordinary circumstances. Her pre-fight ritual consisted of stretching her neck slightly to the left, then slightly to the right, followed by what appeared to be a brief examination of her fingernails. This was in stark contrast to Krex'thor, who was currently performing an elaborate series of ceremonial combat poses that involved rotating his torso 360 degrees, while his arms moved in patterns that would have made a particularly artistic octopus envious. The more techie delegation began taking odds on whether the human would survive the opening exchange. The Zalonians started a pool on how many pieces she would end up in. The Thrakans simply began sharpening their claws in anticipation of what they assumed would be a demonstration of their species' superiority. In the human section, a small group of Earth's diplomatic corps watched with the resigned expression of beings who had seen this particular tragedy play out dozens of times before. They had long ago stopped trying to explain to other species that humans might possess advantages that weren't immediately apparent. After 47 years of consistent defeats, even they were beginning to wonder if Earth's insistence on participating was less about proving human worth and more about some sort of elaborate cosmic performance art. The arena's environmental systems kicked into high gear, adjusting the atmospheric composition to accommodate both species. For Krex'thor, this meant increasing the ambient temperature to roughly the level of a moderately enthusiastic volcano and adding trace amounts of sulfur that would enhance his natural healing abilities. For Zara, it meant maintaining standard Earth normal conditions, which the arena's systems accomplished with the sort of board efficiency typically reserved for the most routine maintenance tasks. The referee, a floating geometric construct that had achieved sentience sometime during the previous century and had been trying to figure out what to do about it ever since, drifted to the center of the arena. Its communication array flickered with the standard pre-combat warnings, delivered in 43 different languages simultaneously, creating a cacophony that roughly translated to "please try not to die in any way that would create excessive paperwork." Krex'thor limbered up by casually tearing a practice dummy in half, each piece regenerating into a complete dummy within seconds, creating what appeared to be an impromptu demonstration of spontaneous dummy generation. The crowd loved this sort of thing. It suggested power, dominance, and the sort of casual destruction that made for excellent arena highlights. Zara, meanwhile, had moved on from examining her fingernails to what appeared to be a careful inspection of the arena floor. She walked in a small circle, occasionally pausing to look at particular sections with the focused attention of someone either conducting a geological survey or completely losing her mind under pressure. The betting pools reached a frenzy that bordered on the mathematical sublime. The Kuparian bookmakers had to activate their emergency calculation matrices to handle the volume of wagers being placed on various aspects of the upcoming defeat. How long would the human last? Would she manage to land a single blow? Would she survive long enough to surrender formally? Or would the match end with what the champion's official terminology delicately referred to as involuntary participant dispersal? What none of the spectators, bookmakers, or even the arena's sophisticated analytical systems had bothered to consider was the possibility that 47 years of consistent defeat might have taught the human participants something other than how to lose gracefully. The opening bell, a crystalline chime that resonated across 17 dimensions and sounded like the universe clearing its throat, marked the beginning of what everyone assumed would be a very short and very predictable contest. Krex'thor launched himself forward with the fluid grace of a predator who had never encountered prey that posed any actual threat. His forearms moved in a coordinated pattern that would allow him to strike, grapple, and defend simultaneously, while his powerful legs propelled him across the arena floor at speeds that would have made a ground vehicle envious. Zara, for her part, appeared to be caught completely off guard by this development. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with what looked suspiciously like panic, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated compared to the fluid efficiency of her opponent's approach. The first exchange lasted approximately 3 seconds, and resulted in Zara being lifted off her feet and hurled across the arena with enough force to crater a small mountain. She hit the far wall with an impact that registered on the arena's seismic sensors and slid to the floor in a way that strongly suggested her immediate and possibly permanent discontinuation as a functioning biological entity. The crowd erupted in the sort of satisfied cheering typically reserved for expected outcomes delivered with exceptional efficiency. This was exactly what they had come to see: a demonstration of superior alien physiology, overwhelming human limitations, with casual, almost dismissive ease. Krex'thor raised his arms in premature victory, his hide already showing the signs of enhanced circulation that indicated his body was preparing for the next phase of combat. This was, after all, barely a warm-up exercise. The real entertainment would come from seeing how long he could make the contest last without actually killing the human outright. Zara lay motionless against the arena wall for what felt like several minutes, but was actually approximately 15 seconds. When she finally began to move, it was with the slow, painful effort of someone whose body had just been introduced to the concept of physics in the most unforgiving way possible. She struggled to her hands and knees, shook her head as if trying to dislodge something, and then began the laborious process of standing up. This took considerably longer than it should have, and involved several false starts, where she appeared to lose her balance and nearly collapse again. Krex'thor, showing the sort of sporting patience that had made his species beloved throughout the galaxy, waited for her to regain her footing before launching his second attack. This was not mercy so much as professional courtesy. Defeating an opponent who was still lying on the ground would have been considered poor form, even by Thraken standards. The second exchange followed the same pattern as the first, except with more violence and less subtlety. Zara managed to raise her arms in what might have been a defensive gesture before being struck by what could best be described as a controlled avalanche wearing armor. This time she didn't just hit the wall, she actually bounced off it, ricocheted off the floor, and came to rest in a position that strongly suggested her skeleton had decided to explore some alternative organizational structures. The arena's medical sensors began registering readings that indicated severe trauma across multiple biological systems. The automated safety protocols started calculating the precise moment when they would need to intervene to prevent what the system's diplomatic subroutines euphemistically termed an unfortunate diplomatic incident resulting from contestant mortality. Zara's recovery from the second impact took considerably longer. She lay still for almost 30 seconds, breathing in a way that suggested her respiratory system was having second thoughts about its career choice. When she finally began to move, it was with the sort of careful, measured effort typically associated with beings who have recently discovered that their body contains several previously unknown stress fractures. The crowd was beginning to grow restless. This level of one-sided domination was entertaining, but only to a point. The spectacle of watching someone get systematically dismantled was thrilling for the first few minutes, but without some element of competition, it quickly devolved into something resembling a very expensive medical emergency conducted for public amusement. Krex'thor, sensing the crowd's mood and his own growing boredom, decided to end the contest with the next exchange. He had demonstrated his superiority, proven his species' dominance, and provided the sort of spectacle that would ensure favorable coverage in the galactic sports networks. There was no point in dragging things out further. He approached Zara's prone form with the casual confidence of a predator who had never encountered prey capable of meaningful resistance. She was struggling to push herself up from the arena floor, her movements slow and obviously painful. Her breathing was labored, her posture suggested multiple injuries, and her overall appearance was that of someone who had recently lost a disagreement with a small asteroid. This was exactly the sort of pathetic display that confirmed every alien species' assumptions about human physical capabilities. Humans were weak, fragile, and completely unsuited for serious combat. They possessed no natural weapons, no defensive capabilities, and apparently no survival instincts beyond the ability to absorb punishment in increasingly creative ways. The more techie delegation had already begun calculating the precise medical costs that Earth's government would need to cover. The Zilonians were updating their species' official records to include this match as another data point in their comprehensive analysis of human inferiority. The Thraken were already planning the victory celebration that would commemorate this latest demonstration of their natural superiority. What none of them noticed, primarily because none of them were particularly interested in looking, was the expression on Zara's face as she slowly pushed herself upright. It was not the expression of someone who had been beaten. It was not the face of someone experiencing defeat, despair, or even significant pain. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to do something that was going to surprise everyone involved. The referee's countdown had reached 7, when Zara finally managed to achieve something resembling vertical stability. She swayed slightly, as if her inner ear was still negotiating with her brain about which direction qualified as up, but she was undeniably standing. Krex'thor moved in, for what everyone assumed would be the finishing blow. His approach was measured, controlled, and utterly confident. He had already won. This was simply the formal conclusion of an inevitable process. The countdown reached 8. Zara looked up at her approaching opponent with eyes that were suddenly, startlingly clear. The confusion was gone. The pain was gone. What remained was the sort of focused attention typically associated with predators who had been patiently waiting for their prey to move into optimal striking position. The countdown reached 9. Krex'thor drew back his primary striking arm, preparing to deliver the sort of blow that would end the contest decisively and mercifully. His other 3 arms positioned themselves to catch Zara's body and prevent any additional trauma that might cause diplomatic complications later. The countdown reached 9 3/4. Zara moved. It wasn't a particularly dramatic movement. It wasn't the sort of spectacular display of martial arts mastery that would inspire songs or generate arena highlights. It was, instead, the most precisely calculated and efficiently executed combat technique that the Interstellar Combat Championships had witnessed in their entire 3-century history. She stepped forward and slightly to her left, moving inside Krex'thor's strike radius with timing so perfect that it suggested either supernatural reflexes or an understanding of Thraken combat techniques that bordered on the prophetic. Her right hand moved in a small, seemingly casual gesture that connected with a specific point just below Krex'thor's primary sensory cluster. The impact was barely audible. Most of the spectators didn't even see it happen. The arena's sensors registered a force reading so minimal that it fell well within the margin of error for atmospheric pressure variations. Krex'thor stopped moving, not in the gradual way that indicated unconsciousness or system shutdown. Not in the dramatic fashion that suggested overwhelming trauma or spectacular defeat. He simply stopped, as if someone had reached into the universe's control panel and pressed the pause button on his specific section of reality. For approximately 3 seconds, nothing happened. Krex'thor remained frozen in mid-strike, his massive form suspended in a combat pose that suddenly looked less intimidating and more resembling an extremely expensive sculpture with questionable artistic merit. Then he collapsed. It wasn't a fall so much as a structural failure. His legs buckled, his arms dropped to his sides, and his entire body settled to the arena floor with the sort of finality typically associated with geological processes. He remained conscious, his eyes tracking movement and his mouth occasionally emitting small sounds that might have been words in Thraken, but he appeared to have lost all voluntary control over his muscular system. The arena fell silent with a completeness that suggested the universe itself had temporarily forgotten how to produce sound. 60,000 spectators, representing dozens of species from across the galaxy, sat in absolute quiet as their collective understanding of reality underwent some urgent and uncomfortable adjustments. Zara looked down at her fallen opponent with the sort of mild interest someone might show when discovering an unexpectedly large insect in their living space. She appeared to be completely uninjured, moving with fluid ease that suggested her previous display of trauma had been somewhat exaggerated for dramatic effect. She walked over to where Krex'thor lay paralyzed and knelt beside him with the careful attention of a medical professional conducting a routine examination. She checked his pulse, examined his pupils, and then did something with her fingers along his spine that caused his muscular control to return in stages, starting with his extremities and working inward. Within 30 seconds, Krex'thor was sitting upright, looking confused but otherwise undamaged. He flexed his arms experimentally, rotated his torso through its full range of motion, and then stared at Zara with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering several fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. The arena's silence stretched on until it became less an absence of sound and more a physical presence that pressed against the spectators with increasing weight. The Morteki delegation had stopped floating and were now resting on the floor of their viewing area, apparently having forgotten how to maintain their levitation abilities. The Zelenians had retracted into their crystalline shells, a defensive response typically triggered only by encounters with existential uncertainty. The Thraken section was motionless, except for the occasional twitch that indicated their collective nervous systems were attempting to process information that didn't fit into any previously established categories. Vorthak the Eternal was the first to recover his voice, though what emerged was less commentary and more a series of sounds that might have been language if language had suddenly decided to explore abstract art as a career option. Ladies and beings, he finally managed, I believe. That is to say, it appears. What we have just witnessed. Zixnox's 1,000 eyes were rotating in patterns that would have been hypnotic if hypnotism had been having a nervous breakdown. The human, he said, his voice carrying the sort of careful precision typically reserved for diffusing explosive devices, appears to have won. This announcement triggered a response from the crowd that began as confused murmuring and rapidly escalated into something resembling controlled chaos. The betting pools crashed simultaneously as the Cuparian bookmakers' mathematical systems encountered their first genuine impossibility and responded by temporarily forgetting how numbers worked. The arena's automated systems, designed to handle every conceivable outcome from routine victory to apocalyptic disaster, had no protocols for processing what had just occurred. The medical censors continued to insist that Krex'thor had suffered no significant trauma. The combat analyzers maintained that no effective strike had been delivered. The victory determination algorithms were trapped in recursive loops, endlessly calculating the probability of an event that had already happened, but statistically couldn't exist. Zara stood up, brushed some dust off her outfit, and walked toward the arena exit with the same casual demeanor she had displayed during her entrance. She paused at the boundary of the combat area and turned back to wave at the crowd, a gesture so thoroughly ordinary that it somehow made everything that had preceded it seem even more impossible. The human section erupted in cheering that was equal parts celebration and hysteria. 47 years of systematic defeat had been erased in a single moment, replaced by something that none of them fully understood, but all of them were absolutely certain they wanted to celebrate immediately and extensively. The diplomatic corps sat in stunned silence, frantically calculating the political implications of humanity's first championship victory. Trade negotiations that had been stalled for decades would need to be reconsidered. Defense treaties would require revision. The entire galactic balance of power had just shifted in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. In the arena's medical bay, Krex'thor was undergoing examination by a team of specialists who were becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to determine what had happened to him. He was uninjured, his systems were functioning normally, and his only symptom was a tendency to stare into the distance, while muttering things like, "How did she know?" and "impossible," in increasingly bewildered tones. The official investigation that followed would consume months of intensive analysis and produce a report that was immediately classified at the highest levels of galactic security. The conclusion, which satisfied no one and explained nothing, was that Zara had somehow identified and exploited a previously unknown vulnerability in Thraken physiology that allowed for temporary nervous system disruption through precise pressure point manipulation. What the investigation failed to discover, primarily because none of the investigators thought to ask the right questions, was that humans had spent 47 years losing fights while carefully studying every aspect of alien combat techniques, physiology, and psychology. They had built a comprehensive database of vulnerabilities, weaknesses, and exploitable characteristics for every major species in the galaxy. They had been conducting the most extensive intelligence-gathering operation in galactic history, while everyone assumed they were simply very bad at fighting. The victory celebration in the human section continued for several hours, though it was somewhat subdued by the gradual realization that Earth now possessed something that was simultaneously invaluable and extremely dangerous: a reputation for being unpredictable. Every species in the galaxy would now need to reconsider their assumptions about human capabilities, and none of them were entirely certain what those capabilities might actually include. Zara had long since departed the arena, but her impact continued to ripple through galactic society like a stone dropped into a perfectly still pond. The championships would continue, but they would never again be quite the same. The comfortable certainties that had governed interspecies relations for centuries had been replaced by questions that no one was entirely sure they wanted answered. The Interstellar Combat Championships had always prided themselves on their ability to determine the relative combat effectiveness of different species through direct competition. It was a simple, straightforward system that provided clear answers to fundamental questions about strength, skill, and survival. What they had failed to consider was the possibility that some species might approach the concept of competition from an entirely different perspective, treating apparent defeat as a form of victory and systematic loss as the most efficient path to ultimate success. In the end, the most remarkable thing about Zara's victory was not the technique she had used or the speed with which she had achieved it. It was the fact that humanity had managed to conduct a 47-year deception so complete that they had convinced the entire galaxy, and possibly themselves, that they were simply not very good at fighting. The universe, it turned out, was full of surprises. Most of them, however, were not nearly as well planned as this one.